He gave up fighting the disease, but a cat brought unexpected strength. The November wind carried the scent of dying leaves through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, a modest neighborhood where vinyl-sided houses stood like weathered sentinels against the approaching winter. Elias Monroe had always loved this time of year, the way autumn surrendered gracefully to winter's embrace, the way the world seemed to exhale one last breath before settling into peaceful silence. But now, as he stood in his doorway clutching a handwritten sign that read, "No visitors," the approaching season felt less like peace and more like an ending. At 64, Elias had the kind of face that spoke of decades spent in classrooms, patient lines etched around gray eyes that had once sparkled when discussing Steinbeck or Hemingway with eager students. His salt and pepper beard, now grown longer than he'd ever allowed during his teaching years, framed a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. The diagnosis had come 18 months ago, a slow, creeping illness that the doctors explained in careful, clinical terms that somehow made it sound both manageable and inevitable. He had fought it at first, followed every treatment protocol, swallowed every pill, endured every procedure with the stoic determination that had carried him through 30 years of educating teenagers about the power of literature. But somewhere between the third round of treatment and the fourth disappointing scan, something inside him had simply stopped. The medicine bottles now sat unopened in the bathroom cabinet, their labels blurred by dust and neglect. The appointment cards lay scattered in a kitchen drawer, their dates passed, their reminders ignored. "That's enough," he had whispered to his empty house 3 days ago, the words echoing off walls lined with books he would never finish reading. "I'm tired of fighting what can't be won." The decision had brought an odd sense of relief. No more early morning drives to the hospital, no more sitting in sterile waiting rooms surrounded by the quiet desperation of other patients. No more pretending that hope was anything more than a cruel joke played by time itself. He would face whatever came next on his own terms, in his own house, with whatever dignity he could muster. The sign felt heavier than it should as he reached for the door handle. Even his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been bringing him casseroles twice a week since spring, would have to respect this boundary. The mailman, the occasional church volunteer, the well-meaning friends from his former life, they would all see the sign and understand that Elias Monroe had chosen solitude. But as his fingers touched the cold brass of the door handle, a sound stopped him cold. It wasn't quite a meow, more like a hoarse, muffled cry that seemed to come from somewhere impossible. Elias frowned, tilting his head toward the front door. The sound came again, definitely feline but oddly contained, as if it were trapped somewhere small and echoing. His mailbox. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Elias set the sign aside and stepped onto his small concrete porch, his bare feet immediately regretting the contact with the cold surface. The old bronze mailbox, a sturdy fixture that had weathered 2 decades of Cedar Grove seasons, sat at the end of his walkway like a small monument to better days. The sound was definitely coming from inside it. "What in the world?" he muttered, shuffling down the 3 steps and across the path lined with the skeletal remains of his once prized rose bushes. As he approached the mailbox, the crying grew more insistent. He lifted the metal flap with the caution of someone who had learned not to expect good surprises, and immediately jerked backward as something grey and furry launched itself from the dark interior and landed with surprising grace on the frost-brown grass at his feet. A cat. Not just any cat, but one that looked like it had been painted with smoke and starlight. Its fur was a deep charcoal grey that shifted to silver in the pale morning light, and its eyes, amber gold like late afternoon honey, fixed on Elias with an intensity that was almost unsettling. The animal was small, probably young, with fur that stuck up in all the wrong places, and a thin frame that spoke of too many missed meals. "How did you—" Elias began, then shook his head. Of course. The mailbox door didn't latch properly anymore, hadn't for months. The cat must have squeezed inside seeking warmth and somehow triggered the mechanism that held the door shut. The cat sat perfectly still, watching him with those remarkable eyes, making no attempt to flee. Its tail, darker than the rest of its body, twitched once, then settled around its feet like a perfectly placed exclamation mark. "Shoo," Elias said weakly, making a half-hearted gesture with his hands. "Go on, get out of here." The cat tilted its head slightly, as if considering this suggestion, then completely ignored it. Instead, it began to clean its left front paw with the focused attention of someone who had all the time in the world. Elias felt a familiar tightness in his chest, not the physical pain that had become his constant companion, but the emotional squeeze that came whenever something required him to care, to act, to engage with the world beyond his carefully constructed bubble of resignation. He couldn't take on a stray animal. He had neither the energy nor the inclination to nurse another living thing back to health when he couldn't even manage that feat for himself. "I'm serious," he said, his voice stronger now. "You can't stay here. I can't." But as he spoke, a gust of November wind swept across the yard, carrying with it the sharp bite of early winter and the promise of snow. The cat's fur ruffled, and for just a moment, Elias caught a scent that stopped him mid-sentence. The clean, fresh smell of rain mixed with something else, something alive and warm and utterly vulnerable. Without quite knowing why, he found himself bending down. The cat didn't move as his hands approached, didn't flinch when his fingers made contact with its damp fur. The moment his palms cradled the small body, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the simple, undeniable presence of another living being who needed him. The cat was lighter than he expected, all bones and determination beneath its disheveled coat. As he lifted it, the animal settled against his chest with the trust of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Elias could feel its heart beating, fast and strong, a rhythm that seemed to echo his own pulse back to him in double time. "Damn it," he whispered, knowing he was about to make a decision that would complicate everything he had planned for his remaining days. He carried the cat inside, noting how it immediately began to purr, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated against his ribs like a tiny engine. In the kitchen, he set it down on the worn linoleum floor and watched as it immediately began exploring, sniffing the corners and bases of cabinets with the methodical thoroughness of a detective. Elias found a small ceramic bowl in the cabinet and filled it with water. The cat approached cautiously, sniffed delicately, then began to drink with the careful politeness of a well-mannered houseguest. As it lapped at the water, Elias studied its profile, noting the elegant line of its neck, the alert set of its ears, the way its whiskers twitched with each swallow. "You'll need a name, I suppose," he said, though he immediately regretted the words. Naming something meant keeping it, and keeping it meant caring for it, and caring for it meant accepting responsibility he had specifically decided to abandon. But the word that came to his lips felt right, inevitable even. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "Tomorrow." The cat looked up at him, water droplets clinging to its whiskers, and for just a moment, Elias could have sworn he saw understanding in those amber eyes. Then the animal returned to drinking, as if the name had been exactly what it was waiting for. As Elias stood in his kitchen, watching a stray cat drink from a bowl he hadn't used in months, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in the space of those few minutes. The sign for his door lay forgotten on the porch table, and the house that had felt like a tomb just an hour ago now hummed with the quiet energy of 2 heartbeats instead of 1. He didn't know it yet, but the man who had given up fighting was about to discover that sometimes the most important battles begin not with a declaration of war, but with the simple act of filling a bowl with water for a stranger who refuses to leave. Morrow finished drinking and sat back on his haunches, fixing Elias with that intense amber stare. In the growing morning light, the cat looked less like a bedraggled stray and more like something that belonged exactly where it was, as if the universe had spent considerable time arranging for this precise moment in this exact kitchen. And for the first time in months, Elias Monroe felt something other than resignation stirring in his chest. It was small, fragile, and he didn't dare name it yet. But it was there, beating in time with a cat's contented purr, reminding him of a truth he had almost forgotten. Sometimes hope arrives not with fanfare, but with the soft sound of 4 paws landing on your kitchen floor, deciding that you're worth saving after all. Elias had intended to keep his distance. He set up a comfortable corner in the laundry room with an old blanket, placed food and water bowls at what he considered a respectful distance, and told himself this would be temporary, just until the weather improved and he could find the cat a proper home. But Morrow had other plans entirely. The first sign that his careful boundaries meant nothing came at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. Elias had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and counting the familiar aches that announced each new day, when a sound pierced the morning quiet, like an alarm clock designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor. The meowing wasn't just loud, it was operatic, a rising and falling wail that seemed to echo through every room of the small house. "Dear God," Elias muttered, pressing a pillow over his head. But the sound continued, now accompanied by the rhythmic scratching of claws against his bedroom door. He lay there for 10 minutes, hoping the cat would give up and go back to the laundry room. Instead, the meowing grew more insistent, more creative in its variations, as if Morrow were running through his entire vocabulary of demands. Finally, defeated by the sheer persistence of it, Elias threw back his covers and opened the door. Morrow sat in the hallway, tail switching with satisfaction, looking for all the world like he had just won an important negotiation. "What?" Elias asked, his voice rough with sleep and irritation. In response, Morrow simply walked toward the kitchen, pausing every few steps to look back as if to say, "Obviously you're supposed to follow me." And somehow, inexplicably, Elias did. This became their morning routine, though Elias refused to acknowledge it as such. Every day at 7 sharp, the concert would begin, followed by the dignified procession to the kitchen. Morrow would sit by his food bowl and wait, not begging, not demanding, but simply present, until Elias filled it. Only then would the cat eat, but never alone. He would take a few bites, then stop and stare at Elias until the man realized he was expected to prepare his own breakfast as well. "I don't eat breakfast," Elias had protested on the 3rd morning, but Morrow's steady gaze seemed to suggest this was a problem that needed solving, so Elias found himself toasting bread he didn't want, brewing coffee he barely tasted, sitting at his kitchen table while a grey cat delicately consumed kibble from a dollar store bowl. It was during one of these reluctant breakfast sessions that Elias noticed something peculiar. Morrow ate with the kind of careful attention that spoke of remembered hunger, but he never finished everything in the bowl. Instead, he would eat precisely 2/3 of his food, then push the bowl slightly away with his paw and begin his post-meal grooming ritual. The remaining kibble would sit there all day untouched, like a security deposit against future uncertainty. "Smart," Elias found himself saying aloud. "Always save something for later." The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than he had intended. When was the last time he had saved anything for later? When had he stopped believing there would be a later worth saving for? As November deepened into the kind of grey, persistent cold that made Cedar Grove look like a faded photograph, Morrow began expanding his influence beyond the kitchen. Elias discovered this when he went to draw the living room curtains more tightly shut, a daily ritual that blocked out both the weak winter sun and the sight of neighbors going about their purposeful lives, only to find Morrow already stationed on the windowsill. The cat had somehow managed to work one corner of the heavy fabric aside, creating a small triangle of light that fell across his grey fur like a spotlight. He sat perfectly still, watching the world outside with the focused attention of a scholar studying a particularly complex text. "Move," Elias said, reaching for the curtain. Morrow looked at him with what could only be described as polite refusal. His amber eyes conveyed a clear message. This window is now occupied. Find another way to hide from the world. Elias found himself in a staring contest with a cat, and to his amazement, he was the first to look away. The curtain remained partially open. By the end of the week, more windows had been conquered. Morrow had a strategic approach to his campaign, targeting first the windows with the best views of bird activity, then gradually expanding to include any source of natural light. Elias's house, which had been as sealed and dim as a tomb, began to let in tentative fingers of daylight that revealed dust motes dancing in the air and highlighted the warm colors of book spines he had forgotten he owned. The most unsettling development came during Elias's afternoon rest periods. His illness brought waves of fatigue that could fell him without warning, leaving him sprawled on the living room couch with every joint aching and his breathing shallow and labored. These episodes had become some of his darkest moments, times when the reality of his condition felt most inescapable, when the silence of the house pressed against him like a weight. But now, during these vulnerable hours, something extraordinary happened. As soon as Elias settled on the couch, usually with a pained sigh that he didn't realize he was making, Morrow would appear, not with the demanding urgency of breakfast time, but with a quiet deliberation that spoke of deeper purpose. The cat would leap onto the couch, circle once to find the perfect position, then settle directly on Elias's chest. At first, the additional weight felt like an intrusion, another burden for lungs that already struggled. But as Morrow began to purr, something shifted. The sound was deeper than any purr Elias had ever heard, a rich, thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate through his entire torso. Mysteriously, his breathing began to slow and deepen. The tight, panicked sensation that often accompanied his rest periods eased into something calmer, more rhythmic. Elias found that if he concentrated on the steady rumble of Morrow's purr, he could match his breathing to its cadence, creating a kind of meditation he had never consciously learned. "What are you doing to me?" he whispered during one of these sessions, his hand resting lightly on Morrow's warm back. The purring intensified slightly, as if in response, and Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the sense that his body was working with him rather than against him. Dr. Richardson would probably have a scientific explanation for this, he thought, something about the frequency of purring and its documented effects on human physiology. But lying there in the filtered afternoon light, with a cat whose presence seemed to somehow regulate his very heartbeat, Elias found he didn't care about the science. For the first time since his diagnosis, he felt like something other than a patient. The first real test of their developing relationship came on a particularly difficult Tuesday in early December. Elias had woken to find his hands shaking uncontrollably, a side effect he recognized from the early days of treatment, back when he still bothered to read the lengthy warnings on medication labels. The tremors made simple tasks nearly impossible. He spilled coffee grounds across the counter, dropped Morrow's food bowl twice, and finally gave up trying to open a can of soup for lunch. Morrow watched these struggles with the patient attention of a nurse who had seen it all before. When Elias finally collapsed at the kitchen table, head in his hands, the cat approached with unusual gentleness. Instead of his typical demand for attention, Morrow simply pressed against Elias's leg, a warm, steady presence that seemed to say, "I'm here. Whatever this is, I'm here." "I used to teach literature," Elias found himself saying, his voice barely above a whisper. 30 years of showing kids that words matter, that stories can change everything, and now I can't even hold a coffee cup steady." Morrow responded by jumping onto the table, normally forbidden territory, and settling himself close enough that his fur brushed against Elias's forearms. The cat's purr was quieter than usual, almost conversational, as if he were offering commentary on the situation. "You know what the worst part is?" Elias continued, surprised to find himself talking to a cat about things he had never said aloud. "I spent my whole career teaching kids about courage. Hemingway's grace under pressure, Steinbeck's dignity in hardship. And here I am the first time I face real adversity, and I just quit." Morrow's amber eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. Then the cat did something extraordinary. He reached out one grey paw and placed it gently on Elias's wrist, right over the pulse point where his blood beat its uncertain rhythm. The gesture was so deliberately tender, so unmistakably intentional, that Elias felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, but opening, like the first fissure in winter ice that promises the eventual return of spring. "Maybe," he whispered, "maybe quitting isn't the same as losing." As if in response, Morrow began to purr again, and this time the sound seemed to carry a message that Elias was only beginning to understand. "You're not alone in this. Whatever comes next, you're not facing it alone." That evening, for the first time in months, Elias found himself reaching for a book, not one of the heavy philosophical tomes that had once been his academic bread and butter, but a simple collection of short stories he had assigned to countless students over the years. As he settled into his reading chair, a piece of furniture that had been gathering dust since spring, Morrow claimed the matching ottoman, curling into a perfect circle of grey contentment. They sat together in the pool of lamplight, the house quiet around them except for the soft whisper of turning pages and the steady rhythm of feline breathing. Outside, December wind rattled the windows, but inside, something new was taking root, fragile as a seedling, but undeniably alive. Elias read until his eyes grew heavy, and when he finally closed the book, he realized he had no memory of the familiar aches that usually marked the end of each day. His body felt not healthy, exactly, but inhabited in a way it hadn't for months, as if he had been living as a ghost in his own skin, and someone, had finally called him back to the land of the living. Morrow stretched, yawned, and fixed him with a look that clearly communicated, "Tomorrow, we'll do this again. And the day after that. And the day after that." For the first time in longer than he could remember, the promise of tomorrow felt like something other than a threat. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in mid-December, announced not by Morrow's usual 7 o'clock serenade, but by its absence. Elias woke naturally, which immediately felt wrong, like waking up to find that gravity had stopped working or that the sun had forgotten to rise. The house carried an odd quality of silence, not the comfortable quiet he had grown accustomed to, but the hollow emptiness of a space suddenly missing its most vital occupant. "Morrow!" he called, his voice echoing strangely in the bedroom. No response. No flash of grey fur, no amber eyes appearing in the doorway, with that particular look of feline patience that had become such a constant in his life. Elias pulled on his robe and slippers, moving through the house with growing urgency. The laundry room was empty, the food bowl untouched since the previous evening. Every window seat, all of Morrow's carefully chosen territories, stood vacant. The back door was still securely latched, but as Elias checked the front entrance, his heart sank. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to allow a determined cat to slip through. He must have failed to latch it properly after bringing in the mail yesterday evening. "Morrow!" he called from the front porch, his voice carrying across the frost-brittle morning air. "Morrow, come back!" The neighborhood responded with the kind of suburban silence that felt like judgment. Mrs. Patterson was already out retrieving her newspaper, bundled in a quilted robe that made her look like a walking comforter. She looked up at the sound of his voice, her eyebrows rising in surprise at seeing Elias outside, calling for a cat she hadn't known he possessed. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "My cat," Elias said, the words feeling both foreign and absolutely natural. "He's gone missing." The panic that followed was unlike anything Elias had experienced, even during the worst moments of his illness. This wasn't the slow, creeping dread of a diagnosis or the rational fear of an uncertain prognosis. This was immediate, visceral, the kind of terror that comes when you suddenly realize how much something means to you, only after it disappears. He spent the morning searching every yard on his block, calling Morrow's name until his throat was raw. He checked under parked cars behind garbage cans, in the small patches of woods that bordered Cedar Grove. The temperature was dropping, and clouds were gathering with the promise of the season's first real snow. The thought of Morrow alone in the coming storm made Elias's chest tighten with something that felt suspiciously like grief. By afternoon, desperation drove him to do something he hadn't done in months: ask for help. He knocked on doors he had been carefully avoiding since spring, spoke to neighbors whose names he had to fish from memory, described a grey cat with amber eyes to people who looked at him with varying degrees of surprise and concern. "I didn't know you had a cat," said Tom Morrison from 3 houses down, a man Elias remembered as having strong opinions about proper lawn care. "He's new," Elias replied, the understatement feeling ridiculous even as he said it. It was Mrs. Patterson who finally provided the lead he needed. She appeared at his door as the early December dusk was settling over the neighborhood, her face bright with the particular satisfaction of someone who has solved an important mystery. "I found your Morrow," she announced. "He's in the Hendersons' backyard 2 blocks over, sitting in their garden shed like he owns the place." The relief that flooded through Elias was so intense it left him lightheaded. Is he okay?" "Seems fine, though he's wearing something he wasn't wearing this morning. A blue collar. Looks official." The walk to the Henderson house felt like the longest 2 blocks of Elias's life. The approaching storm had given the air that particular bite that promised significant snow, and his breath came in sharp puffs that dissipated quickly in the wind. But underlying his concern about the weather was a deeper worry about that blue collar. Where had it come from? What did it mean? He found Morrow exactly where Mrs. Patterson had said he would be, sitting calmly in the Hendersons' garden shed, as if he were holding court. The cat looked up at Elias's approach, with an expression that somehow managed to convey both, "What took you so long?" and "Everything is perfectly fine." But everything wasn't perfectly fine. The blue collar around Morrow's neck was clearly institutional, the kind used by animal shelters and veterinary clinics. It was bright and new, with a small tag that caught the fading light. "Where did you get this?" Elias asked, kneeling down to read the tag. The words printed there made his blood run cold. "Property of Cedar Grove Animal Sanctuary. If found, please return." The implications hit him like a physical blow. Morrow wasn't a stray who had chosen Elias's mailbox as a convenient shelter. He belonged to someone else, had an owner who was probably searching for him, just as frantically as Elias had searched today. All those weeks of growing attachment, of learning to structure his days around another creature's needs, of discovering that he could still care for something other than himself, all of it had been built on a foundation that wasn't his to claim. "Come on," he said quietly, scooping Morrow into his arms. "Let's get you back where you belong." The Cedar Grove Animal Sanctuary was a modest building on the edge of town, the kind of place that survived on donations and the dedication of volunteers who truly believed in second chances. Elias had driven past it countless times over the years, but had never had occasion to stop. Now, carrying a cat who purred contentedly against his chest, despite the circumstances, he felt like he was approaching the site of a necessary amputation. The woman behind the front desk had the kind, weathered face of someone who had seen every possible combination of human and animal drama. Her name tag read Sarah, and she looked up from her paperwork with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to both happy endings and heartbreak. "Can I help you?" "I found this cat," Elias said, though the words felt like lies. Morrow hadn't been lost exactly. He had been living, thriving even, in a house where he was wanted. "He's wearing one of your collars." Sarah's expression immediately brightened. "Oh, you found one of our adoption candidates. Which one is this?" She came around the desk to get a closer look, and Morrow submitted to her examination with the dignity of someone accustomed to professional handling. Sarah checked the collar tag, then looked up at Elias with obvious pleasure. "This is Smokey, though I see someone's been calling him something else." She had noticed the way Elias's lips had formed the word Morrow before catching himself. "He's one of our success stories, actually. We've had him for about 4 months, but he's been so good at escaping that we started what we call our neighborhood integration program." "Your what?" Sarah's smile grew wider. "Some of our cats are just too smart for their own good. They figure out how to get out of here no matter what we do, but instead of wandering randomly, they seem to have a gift for finding people who need them. So we started letting certain cats spend time in the neighborhoods around here, wearing our identification collars. It's unconventional, but it's led to some wonderful adoptions." The world seemed to tilt slightly around Elias. "Are you saying he escaped here on purpose? That he was meant to find someone?" "I'm saying Smokey, sorry Morrow, has been making rounds in Cedar Grove for about 6 weeks now. We've gotten 3 different calls about him from people in your neighborhood, but he always disappears again before we can pick him up. Until now." She studied Elias's face with the keen perception of someone who had learned to read the deep connections between humans and animals. "I'm guessing he didn't just disappear this time because he found where he wanted to be." The conversation that followed was a blur of paperwork, fees, and medical records. Morrow submitted to a brief examination that confirmed he was healthy, well-fed, and clearly thriving in whatever situation he had found for himself. The adoption fee was reasonable, the required supplies minimal, and the process surprisingly straightforward for someone who had convinced himself that taking care of another living being was beyond his capabilities. But the most extraordinary part came when Sarah handed him a folder containing Morrow's complete history. "He came to us as a stray back in August," she explained. "Someone found him in a parking lot, probably about 4 months old, half-starved and dehydrated. We nursed him back to health, but he never quite settled in here. Too independent, too selective about his humans. We were starting to worry he might not be adoptable through conventional methods." Elias looked down at the cat in his arms, who was purring with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans had finally come to fruition. "So he picked me. Seems that way. And from the looks of things, he picked well." The drive home through the first flurries of snow felt like a victory lap. Morrow sat in the carrier they had provided, not with the resigned patience of a prisoner being transported, but with the calm satisfaction of a diplomat whose negotiations had been successful. Every so often he would make a small chirping sound that seemed to be his version of commentary on the passing landscape. But the real test came that evening, when Elias sat in his reading chair with Morrow curled on the ottoman and tried to process everything that had happened. The cat was legally his now, no longer a temporary visitor whose real life existed somewhere else. This was home officially and permanently. "So what now?" Elias asked aloud, scratching behind Morrow's ears in the way he had learned the cat preferred. Morrow's purr deepened, and he stretched one paw toward the book that lay open in Elias's lap. The gesture was so clearly deliberate, so obviously meaningful, that Elias found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "You want me to keep reading?" The purr intensified, and Morrow settled more deeply into his spot, making it clear that this evening ritual was not negotiable. As Elias read aloud from a collection of poetry he had assigned to students years ago, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in the space of this single day. The man who had woken up alone and panicked had gone to bed with a companion whose presence was no longer accidental or temporary. He had faced the possibility of loss and discovered just how much he had already gained. More importantly, he had taken action to protect something precious to him, had asked for help, had engaged with strangers, had made the kind of commitment he thought he was no longer capable of making. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Outside, the snow was beginning to fall in earnest, transforming Cedar Grove into the kind of winter wonderland that appeared on greeting cards. But inside, in a house that had been slowly opening its windows to light, a man and a cat settled into their first official evening together as a family. As Elias closed the book and prepared for bed, he caught sight of himself in the hallway mirror and stopped in surprise. The face looking back at him was still marked by illness, still carrying the weight of uncertainty about the future. But something in his eyes had changed. There was a spark there, a kind of alertness that spoke of someone who had rediscovered a reason to pay attention to the world. Morrow appeared at his feet, weaving between his legs with the casual affection of someone who had always belonged there. And as they made their way to the bedroom together, their first night as official family, Elias realized that hope wasn't always the grand, dramatic thing he had expected it to be. Sometimes hope was as simple as a grey cat deciding you were worth saving, and then making sure you understood that the choice was yours to accept. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, sliding through the mail slot with the casual efficiency of bureaucracy, delivering unwelcome news. Elias had been in the kitchen, sharing his breakfast ritual with Morrow, when he heard the familiar thud of correspondence hitting his hardwood floor. These days, mail was usually either medical bills he couldn't bring himself to open or advertisements for services he'd never need, so he had developed the habit of letting it accumulate for days before dealing with the depressing pile. But this envelope was different. It bore the official letterhead of the Cedar Grove Condominium Association, and it was marked Urgent Violation Notice in red letters that seemed to pulse with administrative authority. Elias opened it while standing in his hallway, Morrow weaving between his feet with the patient attention of someone who had learned to recognize when his human was upset. The letter's language was formal and unyielding. "Dear Mr. Monroe, it has come to our attention that you are harboring an unregistered pet in violation of Section 12.4 of the Cedar Grove Community Guidelines. All residents must obtain written approval from the condominium board before keeping animals on the premises. Failure to comply within 14 days will result in a fine of $500, with additional penalties of $100 per day until the violation is corrected. Please contact the management office immediately to discuss removal of the animal or begin the approval process." The words blurred as Elias read them twice, then a third time, hoping the meaning might somehow change. 14 days. They were giving him 14 days to either get rid of Morrow or navigate what was undoubtedly a complex bureaucratic process designed to discourage exactly this kind of situation. 6 months ago, this letter would have been the final nail in a coffin he was already building. He would have surrendered immediately, called the animal sanctuary, and returned Morrow with the resigned acceptance of someone who had learned not to fight systems larger than himself. But something had changed in the weeks since Morrow had claimed territory in his heart, and the thought of giving him up felt like volunteering for an amputation. "What do you think?" he asked Morrow, who had settled on his feet with the warm weight of absolute trust. "Fight City Hall?" Morrow's purr rumbled against his ankles, a sound that had become his personal soundtrack to courage. The management office occupied a corner of the community center building, its waiting room decorated with the kind of beige efficiency that made clear this was a place where dreams came to be processed and usually denied. Elias sat in a vinyl chair that squeaked with every nervous adjustment, a manila folder in his lap, containing Morrow's adoption papers, health records, and a letter from the veterinarian attesting to his good behavior and health. The property manager, a woman named Janet Holbrook who wore her authority like armor, reviewed his documents with the expression of someone examining evidence of a particularly disappointing crime. She was younger than Elias, probably in her 40s, with the kind of perfectly controlled appearance that suggested she had never met a regulation she didn't love. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice carrying the patient tone reserved for explaining obvious things to difficult people, "the pet approval process exists for good reasons. We have residents with allergies, concerns about property damage, noise complaints. You can't simply decide to keep an animal and then ask for permission retroactively." "I understand that," Elias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "But there were extenuating circumstances. Morrow, the cat, he was essentially abandoned. I found him in my mailbox during that cold snap in November. It was an emergency situation." Janet's expression didn't soften. "Emergencies are temporary, Mr. Monroe. You've had him for 2 months. That's hardly temporary." Elias felt heat rising in his chest. Not the familiar burn of his illness, but something stronger and more focused. "You're right. It stopped being temporary the moment I realized he was saving my life." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than Elias had intended. Janet's pen paused over the form she had been filling out, and for the first time since he'd entered her office, she looked at him directly rather than at his paperwork. "I'm sorry. I have cancer," Elias said, the words coming easier than they ever had before. "Stage 3 diagnosed 18 months ago. I had given up treatment, given up hope, given up on pretty much everything when Morrow found me. That cat has gotten me back on a schedule, back on medication, back to believing that tomorrow might be worth seeing. So no, Ms. Holbrook, I can't just get rid of him, and I won't." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of someone's phone ringing. Janet set down her pen and really looked at him for the first time, not at a rule breaker to be managed, but at a human being whose life had been altered by 4 paws and a purr. "The board meets next Thursday," she said finally, 7 p.m. in the community room. "If you want to make a formal petition, you'll need to present your case then. I can't promise anything, but—" She paused, something shifting in her expression. "Bring the medical documentation, and maybe some character references for the cat." The week that followed was unlike any Elias had experienced since his diagnosis. Instead of the passive waiting that had characterized his approach to medical appointments and test results, he found himself actively preparing for battle. He called Dr. Richardson's office and requested a letter detailing how pet ownership could benefit someone with his condition. He contacted the veterinarian who had examined Morrow and asked for a comprehensive behavioral assessment. He even found himself knocking on neighbors' doors, asking for written statements about Morrow's impact on the community. The responses surprised him. Mrs. Patterson provided a glowing testimonial about how Morrow had helped her overcome her fear of cats by being consistently gentle during their encounters in the hallway. Tom Morrison, the lawn care enthusiast, wrote a paragraph about how the cat had actually improved the neighborhood by keeping the rabbit population in check. Even the Hendersons, in whose shed Morrow had staged his brief disappearance, offered a statement about his well-behaved nature and obvious bond with Elias. But the most unexpected support came from an encounter Elias hadn't planned. He was at the grocery store buying supplies for what he had begun thinking of as his presentation arsenal, when someone called his name from the next aisle over. "Elias Monroe? Is that you?" He turned to find Clara Hastings, the head librarian from the Cedar Grove Public Library, pushing a cart full of books that had seen better days. Clara was one of those people who seemed to exist in a permanent state of gentle enthusiasm, the kind of person who could make checking out a mystery novel feel like a small adventure. "Clara." "Hello," he said, suddenly aware that this was the first casual social interaction he'd had in months that didn't involve veterinarians or property managers. "I heard you adopted a cat," she said, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned it when she was returning her romance novels. She said he's quite special." Before he could stop himself, Elias found himself telling Clara about Morrow, about the morning in the mailbox, the gradual transformation of his daily routine, the current battle with the condo association. Clara listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that stories mattered, nodding at all the right places and asking questions that showed she was really hearing him. "You know," she said when he finished, "we have a reading program at the library. Pause for reading. Children read to therapy animals to help with their confidence and literacy skills. We've been looking for more animals to join the program. Do you think Morrow might be interested?" The suggestion was so unexpected, so full of possibility, that Elias felt momentarily dizzy. He's very good with people, patient, and he seems to like being read to. "Perfect. If you're interested, I could write a letter for your condo board meeting. Community service programs tend to carry weight with administrative types." That evening, as Elias sat in his reading chair with Morrow curled contentedly on the ottoman, he found himself imagining something he hadn't dared to consider, a future that extended beyond the boundaries of his own survival, a future where Morrow's gentle nature could help other people the way it had helped him, where the cat who had saved his life might have the chance to touch other lives as well. "What do you think?" he asked Morrow. "Ready to become a working cat?" Morrow's response was to stretch luxuriously and fix him with a look that seemed to say, "I've been working this whole time. Now everyone else gets to benefit from my expertise." The night before the board meeting, Elias lay awake running through his presentation, his arguments, his appeals to both logic and compassion. Morrow had claimed his usual position on Elias's chest, his purr providing the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Elias's most peaceful moments. "Tomorrow we find out if they let us stay together," Elias whispered into the darkness. Morrow's purr deepened slightly, and one grey paw came to rest over Elias's heart, right where the fear and hope were fighting their nightly battle for dominance. In that simple gesture, Elias felt something he had almost forgotten existed, the absolute certainty that some things were worth fighting for, and that he was no longer fighting alone. The man who had once planned to face his illness in solitude now had an ally, a reason to engage with the world, and a cause that demanded courage he didn't know he still possessed. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would meet it, not as someone resigned to loss, but as someone who had rediscovered what it meant to have something precious to protect. Outside, January wind rattled the windows of Cedar Grove, but inside a man and his cat settled into sleep, with the quiet confidence of those who have found their place in the world and are prepared to defend it. The community room had never seemed smaller or more intimidating. Elias arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a folder thick with documentation and a heart that felt like it might beat its way out of his chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in the kind of harsh brightness that made even healthy people look sickly. 5 board members sat behind a long table that seemed designed to emphasize the distance between authority and supplication. Janet Holbrook occupied the center seat, flanked by residents Elias recognized but had never spoken to, a retired accountant named Harold Webb, who was known for his militant approach to parking violations, a younger woman in business attire who handled the community's financial matters, an elderly man who served as the building maintenance liaison, and Mrs. Chen, who lived in the unit directly above Elias and had never once complained about any noise from his apartment. "Mr. Monroe," Janet began, her voice carrying the formal tone of someone conducting official business, "you're here to petition for retroactive approval to keep a cat in your unit. Is that correct?" "Yes," Elias replied, standing behind the small podium they had provided for him. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "His name is Morrow, and I'd like to present evidence for why he should be allowed to stay." What followed was the most important 15 minutes of Elias's recent life. He presented Dr. Richardson's letter, which detailed how pet ownership could provide measurable health benefits for someone dealing with chronic illness: improved sleep patterns, reduced blood pressure, increased motivation for self-care. He shared the veterinarian's assessment of Morrow's temperament, his perfect health records, his obvious intelligence and social adaptability. He read testimonials from neighbors, including Mrs. Patterson's touching account of how Morrow had helped her overcome her lifelong fear of cats by being consistently gentle during their hallway encounters. Tom Morrison's statement about the cat's positive impact on the community's rabbit problem drew a few chuckles even from Harold Webb. But the real turning point came when Elias presented Clara Hastings's letter about the library's Pause for Reading program. The Cedar Grove Public Library has extended an invitation for Morrow to join their literacy program, Elias explained, his confidence growing as he spoke. Children read to therapy animals to improve their confidence and reading skills. It's a community service that would directly benefit local families. Mrs. Chen leaned forward with interest. My granddaughter participates in that program. She's mentioned how much the therapy animals help the children feel comfortable. The program is quite successful, Elias continued. Clara Hastings indicated that Morrow's temperament makes him an ideal candidate. He would be contributing to childhood education right here in our community. He could see the shift in the room's dynamics, the way the board members began looking at each other with raised eyebrows and subtle nods. What had started as a simple housing violation was transforming into something more complex, a question of community benefit versus rigid adherence to rules. Harold Webb, who had been taking notes throughout the presentation, looked up with the expression of someone wrestling with an unexpected problem. Mr. Monroe, I have to say, your documentation is comprehensive, but the rules exist for good reasons. If we make an exception for one resident, we set a precedent that could lead to— Harold, Mrs. Chen interrupted gently, my granddaughter has been struggling with reading since she started school. If this cat could help her or help other children like her— She trailed off, but the implication was clear. The youngest board member, who had introduced herself as Lisa Santos, cleared her throat. What would be the terms of approval? Specific conditions that would address our usual concerns about pets in the building? Elias had prepared for this question. I'm proposing a trial period of 1 year, with regular health inspections and behavioral assessments. Any noise complaints or property damage would result in immediate removal. Additionally, Morrow would participate in the library program, which means regular professional evaluation of his temperament and social skills. And if your health situation changes? Janet asked, her voice carrying a gentleness that hadn't been there during their first meeting. The question hung in the air like a challenge. 6 months ago, Elias would have stumbled over it, would have acknowledged the uncertainty of his prognosis and the temporary nature of all his plans. But now, with Morrow's influence having taught him to think in terms of tomorrows rather than endings, he found his answer came clearly. If I'm unable to care for Morrow, I've already arranged for him to be placed with the library program permanently. Clara Hastings has agreed to serve as his guardian. He would continue his community service work, and the children who benefit from the program would maintain their relationship with him. It was a lie, sort of. He and Clara had discussed the possibility in hypothetical terms, but no formal arrangements had been made. Yet as he spoke the words, Elias realized he was making a promise to himself as much as to the board. Whatever happened to him, Morrow's future would be secure. The board requested a 10-minute recess to deliberate. Elias waited in the hallway, pacing the length of the corridor while his mind ran through every possible outcome. Through the community room's windows, he could see the lights of Cedar Grove twinkling in the January darkness, each one representing a household where people and pets lived together without having to justify their bonds to a panel of neighbors. When they called him back in, Janet's expression was unreadable. Mr. Monroe, the board has reached a decision. By a vote of 4-1, we're granting provisional approval for you to keep Morrow, subject to the conditions you outlined. The relief that flooded through Elias was so intense, he had to grip the podium to keep from swaying. Thank you, he managed. Thank you all. There will be a formal review in 6 months, Harold Webb added, his tone suggesting he was the dissenting vote. Any problems at all, and this approval will be revoked. Understood, Elias replied, though he was barely hearing the words through the rush of victory and gratitude. As he walked home through the clear January night, Elias felt like he was moving through a world that had been fundamentally altered. The same streetlights illuminated the same sidewalks, but everything felt different, charged with possibility rather than weighted with resignation. He had fought for something he cared about and won. More than that, he had engaged with his community, made his case, and discovered that even bureaucratic systems could be moved by genuine human need. Morrow was waiting for him at the door, sitting with the patient dignity of someone who had never doubted the outcome of the evening's proceedings. As Elias scooped him up, the cat began to purr with the deep satisfaction of someone whose faith in his human had been thoroughly validated. We did it, Elias whispered into the soft grey fur. We get to stay together. That night, as they settled into their reading ritual, Elias found himself thinking about the library program, about the children who would meet Morrow, about the ways this one small victory might ripple outward into other lives. The book in his lap was a collection of poems about resilience, and as he read aloud, he realized that the words were no longer abstract concepts, but lived experiences. Spring arrived early that year in Cedar Grove, bringing with it the kind of gentle warmth that made winter feel like a distant memory. Elias had started walking again, short trips at first, just to the mailbox and back, then gradually expanding to include the corner store and eventually the library. Morrow had proven to be an excellent walking companion, trotting alongside on a leash with the dignity of someone who understood that fresh air was an important part of both their recovery processes. The Pause for Reading program had been everything Clara had promised and more. Twice a week, Elias would bring Morrow to the library, where children from 6 to 12 would curl up beside him and read stories aloud. The cat's presence seemed to dissolve the self-consciousness that often made struggling readers hesitant to practice. With Morrow's amber eyes focused attentively on their faces and his purr providing a gentle soundtrack, even the most reluctant readers found their confidence blooming. Elias found himself staying for the sessions, initially just to monitor Morrow, but increasingly because he discovered he missed teaching. The children began asking him questions about the stories, about words they didn't understand, about how to make their voices carry the emotions they felt. Without quite realizing how it happened, he became an unofficial assistant in the program, helping Clara manage the logistics while Morrow provided the therapeutic magic that made it all work. On a particularly warm afternoon in April, as Elias sat in the library's garden watching Morrow investigate the spring flowers with scientific thoroughness, Clara joined him on the bench they had positioned to catch the best morning light. "You know," she said, settling beside him with the comfortable ease of someone who had become a genuine friend, "I've been thinking about expanding the program. There's been interest from the senior center, and the hospital has inquired about bringing therapy animals to the cancer ward." The suggestion hit Elias with unexpected force. The cancer ward, the place where he had spent so many hours receiving treatments he eventually abandoned, surrounded by other patients fighting battles he had chosen to surrender. The idea of returning there, not as a patient, but as someone bringing comfort to others facing the same struggles, felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," he said honestly. Clara nodded with the understanding of someone who had learned to recognize the difference between not yet and never. Morrow would be, though, when you're ready. That evening, as they followed their established routine of dinner, reading, and the gradual settling towards sleep, Elias found himself studying Morrow with new eyes. The cat had grown sleek and confident in the months since his arrival, his grey coat now gleaming with health, and his amber eyes bright with the contentment of someone who had found exactly where he belonged. But more than that, he had developed the kind of calm presence that seemed to communicate safety to everyone he met. "You've been training for this your whole life, haven't you?" Elias asked, scratching behind Morrow's ears in the way that never failed to produce the deepest purr. As if in response, Morrow stretched and settled more comfortably against Elias's chest, his warm weight a reminder of all the mornings when that presence had been the difference between despair and hope. 6 months after the condo board meeting, Elias received a letter that should have filled him with dread. His oncologist wanted to see him for follow-up tests, to assess how his condition had progressed during his months without treatment. A year ago, such a letter would have gone straight into the trash, another reminder of a battle he had chosen to abandon. But as Elias held the appointment notice, with Morrow purring on his lap, and the afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been opened in years before a grey cat had claimed them, he realized something had fundamentally shifted in his relationship with uncertainty. He wasn't afraid of what the tests might show, because he had learned the difference between being cured and being healed. Whatever the scans revealed about the state of his body, they couldn't measure the ways his life had expanded beyond the boundaries of his illness. They couldn't quantify the joy he felt watching a shy 8-year-old gain confidence while reading to Morrow, or the satisfaction of knowing that his presence at the library had helped other children discover their love of stories. They couldn't capture the profound sense of purpose he felt every morning when Morrow's 7 o'clock concert announced the beginning of another day worth living. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, the word carrying all the weight of promise and possibility that had been absent from his vocabulary for so long. "Tomorrow, we'll call Dr. Richardson and schedule those tests, and whatever they show, we'll face it together." Morrow's purr deepened, a sound that had become synonymous with courage and continuity, with the understanding that some battles are won not through victory, but through the simple act of continuing to show up for life, day after day, breath by breath. As the sun set over Cedar Grove and the house settled into the comfortable rhythms of evening, Elias Monroe, former teacher, cancer patient, and devoted companion to a gray cat named Tomorrow, opened his book and began to read aloud, his voice carrying the stories forward into another night, another day, another chance to discover what hope looks like when it arrives on four paws and refuses to let you face the darkness alone. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal, and inside, a man who had once given up on fighting learned that sometimes the greatest victory is simply agreeing to see what tomorrow might bring.